All right, pull up those notes here. I want to finish up the chapter. Okay. All right, so this is real short. I'm gonna knock this out real quick, so you guys, because everybody looks like we're pretty exhausted. It's winter time again. It feels like it's hard to get up in the morning. I think. All right, so on Thursday I want to do a review game. All right, and then on Monday I'm going to send out the test. All right, so you guys will have all day to take the test. It'll be open notes and stuff like that. And so this test will be combining chapters 3 and 4. All right, into one test. All right, and then the next week we're going to try to get into the actual kind of the branches of government, starting with the legislative branch. So this last section here is something that we had talked about early on in chapter 1. So it's just going to go in a little bit more detail about it, and you'll see a few questions that are on the test, kind of related to this whole concept of duties and responsibilities. So they kind of added this kind of at the end of this chapter on the amendments, because again, with a lot of the amendments, this idea kind of extending the concept of rights to individuals and states and such. And with rights also comes that concept of responsibilities, all right, like what you're kind of expected to do. So, kind of the definition of what kind of duties of, like, they're going to talk about duties and citizenships here, duties and responsibilities, citizenship. Duties are things that you must do in certain cases to ensure rights and freedoms are protected. Sometimes they can be there can be disincentives, if you will. If you don't do something like this, then something can kind of happen in that. But it's not necessarily kind of tied into necessarily always like punishment, if you will. All right. So some of the duties here of citizenship: one, obeying the laws. All right. That's just basically the whole idea of providing order to society. This is one in which that if you don't, then there are some consequences, right? Your freedom can be taken away. Like I said, there's responsibilities that are kind of tied in with this as well. Attending school was mentioned in the textbook there. What you guys are doing here is this idea of kind of democratic education. Basically, kind of the idea that if you're at least aware of the Constitution, aware of your particular rights and such, that you will be, when you get a little bit older, that you'll be a functioning member of society and a functioning citizen, right? So, to a certain point, right? At one point, was it 16? You can drop out of school if you want legally, all right? Sure. But the idea before that, you should be in school. And if you have kids, you should be putting them in school, right? Unless you're homeschooling them, or this whole situation here that we're talking about with kind of like the whole hybrid learning through COVID. There are some kind of exceptions to the rule, if you will. Third one, paying taxes. And again, we kind of talked about the whole concept of taxes, the idea of kind of providing services. Like right here, you're going to school, right? My salary, the building, maintenance, all this other stuff is provided with mainly property taxes and other funding from, let's say, like state government and federal government and stuff like that. All right. If you don't pay your taxes, there could be some consequences to that. Serving in the armed forces, not something that you necessarily have to do, but at one point in our history, we had the concept of a draft, right? After kind of like the Vietnam War, we've become more of a kind of a volunteer military. But guys, when you turn 18, you have to sign up for something called selective service, just in case they have something in that nature. That's pretty easy. So that's kind of a kind of shift in the kind of duty, if you will. Like I said, draft is essentially just kind of something that we had periodically through the history of the country. Now, like I said, the selective service you have to sign up for. At one point in, like the textbook talks about this, like during the Second World War, there was a number of people that were kind of asked to kind of sacrifice for the war effort. All right? My parents, actually, my dad fought in World War II. My mom remembers that I was like, when I was kind of talking with her, I was like, hey, when the war was over, were you glad, Dad was coming back? She's like, yeah, but I was glad I could wear pantyhose again. All right, because women weren't, so we're kind of, they kind of encourage people to kind of refrain from wearing pantyhose for netting for the war effort. All right. That's something, and again, like, you could even kind of talk about this extension here. The concept of wearing a mask is kind of maybe falls. This is something that we haven't had this kind of like, kind of discussion before, but this kind of maybe falls into the concept of the duties of citizenship, right? And for some people, like like wearing a mask is against their kind of individual freedoms and liberties and stuff like that. For other people, the idea of wearing a mask is just basically kind of doing your kind of service as a citizenship. All right, to make sure that your fellow Americans are not being infected with COVID or whatever. And that's something that's going to later in Chap. When this is discussed years later, this period will probably be mentioned when they discuss this part of the chapter. All right, and then the fifth one here, appearing in court. This is something we get into a little bit more detail when we talk about this chapter 7 and the judicial branch. I mentioned this a little bit in the amendments 6 and 7. We're talking about kind of the concept of a jury. All right, jury duties is basically being called upon to help decide a criminal or civil case. The 6th and 7th Amendment kind of protects that. That kind of provides that right. I don't know if any of your parents have ever had to do jury duty. Usually, people are kind of.
My teacher.
Yeah, I had to do jury duty about 4 years ago, and before that was like 10, almost 20 years before that. All right, so it depends, but it's usually people who are basically registered voters and such. My jury duty kind of consisted of basically like a 2-day court trial. The one before I got picked for the they picked like 24 people, and then they narrow it down to like 12. All right, and so we'll talk about more about juries and the whole concept when we get into chapter 7. All right, and then the responsibility of citizenship is basically things we should do, not required by law, but encouraged. Again, this was mentioned in chapter 1.
Social laws.
What's that?
Laws of society.
Yeah. It's a basically, and again, that's the duties and responsibilities is the issue of wearing a mask, right? I mean, like if you don't wear a mask out in public, you're not going to be they're not fining you per se, all right? But again, it's as a responsibility, kind of like the idea to society as a whole. People are kind of like, it's what we call like a social contract. This idea that's not officially kind of written into law, but it's what's expected of you, all right? And so one important kind of responsibility that's coming up here, voting, all right? Voting is not mandatory. Like in some countries, they have basically it's mandatory, like New Zealand, I believe. But this is a kind of responsibility. And there's the idea that in a democracy, kind of power comes from the idea that power comes from consent of the people. All right. And so you see this now, like on TV ads or whatever, people are basically encouraging people to go out and vote. All right. But if you don't vote, even if you're registered or whatever like that, there is not a penalty associated with that. There's a number of countries, like I said, that make, like when they have their elections, it's a holiday. There's some discussion on that to try to encourage more voting, if you will. But generally, out of like the most democracies in the world, we have a pretty, compared to like the kind of eligible voters in society, we have a pretty low number, compared to other kind of industrial and kind of like kind of democracies. Being informed, right, watching the news, kind of taking interest in certain key issues. This is something, though, and with the kind of development of the internet, has been a situation like when you talk about discussing like kind of like maybe having a class on what we call internet literacy. The idea of kind of basically kind of identifying where there's like, for lack of a better term, fake news, right? So, I'm sure you've heard people who, my generation and older who like get a lot of their information from social media. A lot of that stuff is, you got to kind of do your vetting, if you will. You got to make sure that it's from a kind of reliable source, because they just came out. Just the FBI had mentioned something about how like Iran and Russia are basically having both campaigns to send out disinformation, right, to try to either discourage people from voting for one candidate or another, or just completely discourage them from voting in all. All right. So being informed has become something that wasn't traditionally in the past, something that's kind of divisive. It to this day, where you get your actual information from and whether it's legitimate has become something that's more of a discussion. All right. Taking part in government. All right. And again, this is something that you don't necessarily have to do, and a lot of people don't. But this includes like anything from running for school board, library board, anything that gets involved with any type of government agency or a government entity, if you will. Particularly it doesn't always have to be on the state level or the federal level. It could be basically local. And then helping your community, like volunteering. If you can volunteer at a food bank or anything of that nature, a clothing drive, something like that, you're doing a kind of responsibility, citizenship, but maybe not even thinking about it. Just the idea of just being kind and wanting to help out your fellow man. All right. So this is, again, not something that you have to do, but it's it's encouraged and celebrated to a certain account. All right. I can't think of, let's see. There's respecting and protecting others' rights. Defense of civil human rights is key to equality here. And this is something that's played out like with the summer that we've had, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and people understanding that where there's injustice for one, there's injustice for all concept there. All right, so this is something that a lot of people like your guys' age and stuff are becoming more and more aware of. I think like a lot of the I was reading something where a number of those the protests over the summer, were organized by kids that were 17 years old, which is impressive, and watching some of those interviews with some of those kids that it's nice to see that people getting involved in that. So this is that's a responsibility. Again, the idea, this is something that's pretty simple what people do, and it's again, your guys' generation I think is much better than my generation before when it comes to racial equality and stuff like that, and equality for those who had been traditionally ostracized. I definitely think that your generation gets a lot of flack, but you guys do a lot of things better than my generation did and the generation before that. So that's an aspect of responsibilities, right? I think that's it. Is that it? All right. Okay. All right. So again, like I said, I wanted to do this real short because people probably even at home are probably about ready to fall asleep. All right. So that is chapter 4 in a nutshell. I'm going to stop recording.